Today I want to talk about H.P. Lovecraft, the author, the horror science fiction author, and C.S. Lewis and his argument from reason against atheists. Oh boy. I have no script, so forgive me if this is a little bit meandering, okay? But I had this thought. So I really like H.P. Lovecraft. He's this horror science fiction author. He writes what's called cosmic horror. He's kind of the founder of that genre. It's the horror of the unknown, or rather the unknowable, right? There's often these very scientific, rationalist characters that have a very analytical worldview, and they come face to face with something that is just incomprehensible. Some eldritch horror, some monster or some alien from outer space that's just incomprehensible. And often there are themes of insanity, being driven insane by this knowledge that's not good for us, right? Acquiring knowledge is often bad in Lovecraft films. Like, people who acquire the secret knowledge go crazy. And the reason that's so fascinating, right, is it's just Lovecraft is asking such an interesting question there that I think atheists and rationalists need to ask themselves. There's this idea sometimes in this very rationalist sort of atheist type worldview that not only is knowledge, sort of scientific type analytical knowledge, true, it leads to truth, but that truth is good for you. Right? As Jordan Peterson always says, and as the Bible says, the truth will set you free. There's this presupposition that the truth is going to be good for you. It's going to yield good outcomes, and that it's ultimately going to yield a better world if we know more true things, right? And there's no one that believed that more than the new atheists, right? They would talk about all the time, they would criticize Christianity, not just for being false, but for being bad, right? God is not great. It's morally bad. It's ugly. It's aesthetically ugly. It's ugly and bad. It's not just false. And I always found that fascinating. Why should its being false? Why should its being ugly and bad make it false? Why would that matter? Suppose there is a tyrannical God out there. If he's really real, you should still worship him, shouldn't you? There's this question, though, that Lovecraft inserts. He asks exactly that question. What if ultimate reality, what if the ultimate truth, when you discover it, is not good for you? What if it's ultimate reality is incomprehensible? What if it's this, he talks about these crazy monsters, and what if knowing ultimate reality actually drives you insane, and ignorance is actually bliss? Being ignorant of ultimate truths is actually bliss, and knowing the truth will drive you crazy, drive you insane. Ultimate reality is not fundamentally comprehensible. It's just madness out there. And that's the question. That's the exact same question that C.S. Lewis puts forward in his argument from reason. Alvin Plantinga has another version of this argument called the argument against naturalism. And the argument goes like this. If we accept that, all of our thoughts, right, all of our mental processes are ultimately oriented towards survival. Let's take a purely unguided sort of evolutionary view. All of our thoughts are sort of oriented towards survival, right? Then we can sort of deconstruct all our most basic beliefs. My belief that there are moral truths. Well, there might not be objective moral truths. It might just happen to help me survive if I believe that there are objective moral truths, right? What about my sense that there's some purpose to the universe? There's some purpose to my life. There's some goal for all this. Maybe there isn't. Maybe there isn't purpose to the universe or life. It just happens to help me survive if I believe that's true, right? So these beliefs could be illusions that just happen to help me survive, right? And atheists often cite that about religion. Well, maybe religion, it's very popular to believe in religion, but maybe believing in religion sort of just happens to help you survive. But you don't have to stop there, and you shouldn't stop there if you're being consistent. You can deconstruct all of your views that way. What about my belief that the future will be like the past, right? That's the inductive reasoning problem. What about my belief that 2 + 2 is 4? What about my belief in, modus ponens, right? That if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, right? Deductive reasoning. What if my belief in deductive reasoning is not actually true? What if it just happens to help me survive? What if all these mental processes that I trust just happen to help me survive? They're not actually mapping onto truth, metaphysical truth out there in any meaningful way. And you just end up with this epistemic nihilism. People often misunderstand that argument, right? Their first reaction is to think that maybe it's some gimmick and we can get around it. And they often try to appeal to some principle by which we can distinguish between truth and falsehood. They say, yeah, well, look, some of our beliefs might be false, but there's some principle, and usually it's some kind of epistemic or scientific principle, by which we can distinguish our true beliefs from our false beliefs. But here's the problem. That principle you're appealing to, whatever it is, it's a scientific method, what have you, right? That principle is itself a thought in your mind. It's a mental process. And you can just do the same thing to that thought. You can ask, is that belief true? Or is it just that it helps me survive, right? It could be the case that the scientific method, right? The idea that, if I observe a consistent pattern through experimentation, right? In nature, right? If I see that this pattern has predictive power, therefore it's more likely to be true. That principle itself could be false. It could be the case that that's just a mental process that happens to help you survive. That thought happens to help you survive. It's not actually true. And there's no principle you can appeal to which isn't subject to that same critique, right? That's C.S. Lewis's argument from reason, or Alvin Plantinga's argument against naturalism. You don't have any good reason to trust your own thoughts, your own mind, if you go down this road. Some people really try and embrace that, and they say, well, we can just sort of embrace like an evolutionary definition of truth, which is insane. But what they're saying there is that, well, we're going to define truth not as that which is actually true about the real world out there. Truth is now defined as just thoughts that happen to help me survive. So when I say that the world is round, I don't mean that there's actually something out there which is round. I mean that it happens to help me survive if I believe that the world is round. Crazy, right? Even that is not nihilistic enough, right? That doesn't go far enough. You need to go a step further, because you need to ask, the very claim, my thoughts happen to help me survive. That itself is a thought, right? Well, it must be true because of evolution. Well, that's a thought there too, right? Evolution is true. That's a thought. You can deconstruct that thought. Science is true. That's a thought. You can deconstruct that thought. You can keep going. And if you're consistent about it, you're just going to end up in this just total epistemic madness and nihilism. And this is the question I think atheists need to ask themselves. Why do I believe that my own thoughts are trustworthy? Why do I believe that reality is ultimately comprehensible to me, to my mind, to the kind of thing my mind is? And that's the question that Lovecraft is asking. What if reality is not ultimately comprehensible? What if it's this ultimately, and this is where atheism I think gets you, it's this ultimately incomprehensible brute fact that has no rhyme or reason to it. The kind of thing the universe is utterly alien to me. It is a non-thinking, irrational thing, and I am a thinking, rational being with purposes and values, and it has none, right? And that leads to this epistemic nihilism if you follow it consistently to its logical conclusion. I'm not usually a fan of these this or that argument for God, this or that argument disproves atheism. But this one I really think does. This is the one argument that I just have genuinely never heard a good answer to from an atheist. If you're an atheist out there, or someone that has a good response to this, I'd love to hear it. But I just have never heard one. I sincerely have never heard one, right? To me, this sort of line of argumentation is decisive. And what it leads to is that my mind, the only way around this is to say that my mind, my thoughts, and the way my mind is patterned ultimately corresponds with reality, with ultimate reality. And whatever it is behind ultimate reality, with the ultimate ground of everything. My mind is such that it can comprehend ultimate truth. And not only that, you have to say that there's good reason to go out and pursue that truth. Otherwise, why would you do it? So not only is the truth there and accessible, it is good and beautiful, right? It is good for me to go pursue that truth. The truth will set me free. The truth will improve my life. It's not like the Lovecraftian stories where knowing truth will actually drive me insane and be bad for me. So those are my thoughts. Yeah, so that would be my challenge to the atheists, right? Grapple with Lovecraft. Ask that question. Why is truth good? Why should I pursue it? I think deep down, we all have this sense, and this is sort of an ontological or transcendental argument, that we all have this sense that ultimate reality is true, good, and beautiful. And that's what I call God. God is the true, the good, and the beautiful, or the grounding of that which is true, good, and beautiful. And all those are united, and they're one in God. And if you deny that, if you start denying that there's any ultimate connection between the true, the good, and the beautiful, you end up with this Lovecraftian question. Why should I pursue truth? Why couldn't it be the case that pursuing truth is actually bad for me? Why couldn't it be the case that I should just sort of shut my eyes and blind myself to the universe and abandon rationality even, right? I don't know what the answer would be to that, right? If you don't actually believe that the truth is ultimately good for you. And so that's a kind of transcendental argument. Again, as I said, no one believes in that more than the new atheists. They believe that the truth is ultimately good and beautiful. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent so long trying to tell us that God is not great. Therefore, he's not true. Notice how that logic doesn't work unless you believe in that sort of transcendental argument that I laid out. All right, those are my random thoughts for today. Hope you appreciate them. See you guys next time.